Movie Wars.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a very special, little kind of special, celebratory Friday the 13th special surprise. I've got a dear friend here. This is your host, Kyle. I've got my friend, comedian Matthew Blevins with me. What's going on, man?
Hey, Kyle, how's it going, man? It's great to be here for the Friday the 13th edition of the podcast, man. I'm here for it. Let's go.
Yeah, man. Tell us who you are.
Matthew Blevins. I'm a comedian. I started out my comedy trajectory in the Omaha and Lincoln, Nebraska area, and started out there. Did my first 6 years what I call undergrad work in comedy, and then I moved to the Nashville area about January of I've been here almost 3 years now. Okay, yeah, 21.
Wow.
And yeah, and just trying to find my way in new cities and new scenes. You know how it goes, and But before that, I was a film critic for. It started in 2012, and I think I put a good 5 years into it. It started out on the Rotten Tomatoes message boards, actually. That's where, all of the geeks used to go, and we used to do Photoshop contests and stuff like that. And, those were always fun. And then slowly but surely, I kind of got more confident in expressing my critical opinions about movies. And so I'd get involved in these threads where we would, analyze the films of Andrei Tarkovsky or something like that. And then eventually a position came up on the Toronto-based web publication Next Projection. And they were kind of integrated with the Toronto International Film Festival and TIFF Bell Lightbox. And so it was really cool. So I just thought maybe I could submit and get to write for these guys. And then over time, I had a lot of successful columns, and I became a senior editor there after a couple of years, and I never got any kind of monetary stuff from film criticism or any sort of fame, but I had little bits of notoriety. I had texted you about cool things like waking up one day and finding out that Edgar Wright had retweeted my review of The World's End. And it's oh, wow, that's really cool that he even read something that I wrote. Or Lloyd Kaufman called me condescending one time. That was kind of interesting. I was a Trauma fan, but he's like, your stuff is really well written, but it's a little condescending. And then he called me Roger Ebert Jr. So I'm not sure. I don't know if that was a compliment or if that was a slam, but then he said maybe I should advise on Return to Class of Nukem High 2. Which it's my greatest regret in life that I never advised on that script. So, and then
That's incredible.
Yeah, I interviewed Tommy Wiseau as well. That's something you take away with you for life. It was like talking to an actual vampire. Yeah, it was really cool though. I did a lot of cool stuff in film criticism. And then I just got tired of describing other people's art when I wanted to be out making stuff. And so 2016, I kind of made the transition from film critic to comedian. Primarily, maybe I wasn't being hated enough as a film critic, and then steer into the skid. I'm thinking IRS, maybe that'll be my next move. I'll just be a tax collector or something.
A lot of self-hatred with you, a lot of pseudo-masochism with the things you choose to do. Maybe go work at an ice cream shop for a week. Just kind of find the joy out there.
That sounds exhausting. Finding joy sounds exhausting to me.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think there is always with stand-up comedy, and I love how you linked it back to your criticism career, because stand-up comedy, I had a week like that. I had a couple of weeks where I had a couple of bangers back to back, performances, great gigs, and then I had one where I was like, I'm done. I'm cooking. I'm cooked. I'm never doing this again. You know how it is. And then a week later, looking back at it, I guess I'll go out there and do it again.
I think at 8 years in right now, week to week, I'm not sure if I am a comic anymore most weeks. And it's I have a show this week. I guess I'm a comic this week. So let's go to it. I can't stop writing. That never goes away regardless. But Yeah. And so primarily my love of film came from, then this is true. I would scour HBO and Cinemax and whatever I could find all night long when I was a teenager to find things to masturbate to. And I just sometimes they just play good movies the whole time. So I became a cinephile. Like Doom Generation is a prime example. It like crosses both boundaries. You get to do both. You get to see a great Greg Araki film, and you get to masturbate to Rose McGowan. That could be problematic. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. Hey, we all have a journey, man. No, that's cool. That's cool, dude. Well, right on, man. Well, dude, I'm so glad to have you. And at the end of the episode, we'll talk about where people can find you. You got a lot of great bits out online. I'd love for people to get access to your old editorials and your criticism work. That's fantastic. So, I'll just start why I wanted to do this. I don't love cliches. And when I found out there was a Friday the 13th coming up, I just felt like I haven't talked about Friday the 13th in a long time. And we're not a horror podcast, and I'm going to talk about this later, but horror is such an interesting genre. I would put it out there with Star Trek, and Star Trek has, there's such a specificity to it. And we did a couple years ago on the old version of the podcast, we did a Star Trek episode of the reboot, and I was scared to death because I knew I was putting my toe in the water. Like, I'm a smart film person. Like, I wasn't a critic, but I credit myself for my analysis. I understand at a deep level. I'm a huge fan of philosophy, and I feel like that carries me a long way with my love of film. But then there is genre specific, love and groups and I would put horror, like diehard horror fans out there. They love detail. Yeah.
Yeah. They'll get mad at you if you get details incorrect. And
yes.
I have had the actual Polish diaspora on me for getting a detail incorrect in a documentary one time, but you don't that pales in comparison to messing up a horror reference. So we have to tread carefully here.
Yeah, don't forget a C character that was played by a D-level actor in 1980. Don't forget it. Don't do that. They will get you. Yes. Which I admire, but it's hard as a podcaster. I would say I'm a generalist. I consider myself strong across multiple genres. I'm not so deep on one genre that I'm a specialist, but I'm a generalist. And you put your toe in the water. So I don't want to be cliche, but I was asking myself, if I did a Friday the 13th podcast with one of my comedian buddies, what would that sound like? And to me, the first thing that came to mind is, what's the staying power? The visual of Jason Voorhees when you hear, hey, there's going to be a Friday the 13th this week. And the first time I heard that, the first thing I thought of, that bloody hockey mask.
Yep.
You would be hard pressed. You could name a bunch, but you would be hard pressed to find, no matter how cinematically poorly done those movies are and how inconsistent and how bad the timelines are, it is hard to think of a more recognizable icon than that hockey mask. What do you think about that?
Well, and it's interesting that it's got embedded in us as far as the motion, the lumbering, and that character wasn't even what is embedded in our mind until movie 6. It wasn't even until 3 that he got the hockey mask. And so that's so fascinating to me that this franchise had been 6 movies deep, and it's still defining the cultural consciousness in a certain way, because that you hear Friday the 13th and you have that imagery from sequels that were way down the line.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's wild. And it's you can probably, bang your head against the wall and think of a few examples like that. But to me, you'd be hard pressed to find one that's more, visceral. I would even put it up there, obviously not in quality with The Godfather, but The Godfather has that kind of cultural cachet. You've got Mail. It's a constant reference from Tom Hanks. It's referenceable across the board. And so there are very few things in the cultural discussion that have that level of cachet. And so I was thinking about my own experience with these films. I think I started off with a lot of people. Now I'm a little different. My parents were both alcoholics, crazy people. They let me watch whatever I want. I watched RoboCop twice a week as a kid. And that still to me is one of the most, yeah.
Yeah, no, my dad took me to RoboCop in the theaters, and I think I was 5, and I couldn't pick up my toy guns because I thought an Ed 209 was going to gun me down. So yeah, I think your dad and my dad could have had a beer together for sure.
Yeah, and they probably would have taken us to see, a Friday the 13th movie together.
Probably.
I mean, you could probably argue RoboCop's more violent than the first two Friday the 13th. I mean, it's seriously.
Oh yeah. Don't even get me started on Verhoeven. I mean, I love that guy's work, and RoboCop and being traumatized in a movie theater is probably a part of that. But like Starship Troopers, I watch that every year. I still go back to that.
Still good. Yeah, RoboCop's my favorite of all time. The Movie Wars fan base, they're tired of hearing me talk about it. You see the poster back there. I'm such a I've seen it over 200 times. I'm just a diehard. But I watched Cobra with Sly and the Rambo. Like, I was young, but for some reason my alcoholic parents were principled on horror movies. But I don't know if you have this visceral memory, but do you remember going to the video store when we had them and the horror section was in the back corner, and when you could sneak away from your parents and look at the boxes and the covers. And I just remember seeing Freddy, that one 3D cover. I think Freddy 5 was that 3D cover of his claw coming out, but that mask, that hockey mask on the cover. And I honestly think that in and of itself was enough. And you said something in a text to me that was very interesting. You talked about the primordial kind of that violent, that tendency that's in us that draws us to wanting to be scared and witness violence. I thought that was really interesting because that curiosity alone was enough for me to spend a lot of mental energy figuring out, how can I see these movies? Like, how, when, and how can I see what that movie is?
Absolutely. And the other thing that I think gives The Mask a lot of power specifically is you dehumanize the figure, and then you take those eyes away from it, and now you've got like just the notion of evil chasing you at every corner, and it's never going to give up. So I mean, that's going to resonate forever.
Yeah. Yeah, so continuing my story, like when I did finally get to see them, I think I was 12 when I actually finally started getting them, and I did like them. I liked the cachet of the kind of that experience, that forbidden fruit. Like, I'm not supposed to be seeing this. Like, carried me through. I think, and that carries you through a lot in your youth, with movies. And but eventually I would get on, and we also had a great conversation about Texas Chainsaw, which is actually of the, if you want to take that core, I'd add Scream to that conversation with Ghostface as more of a modern version, which is satire. Yeah. But Leatherface is my guy. Like, I love because the storytelling, the Tobe Hooper story, it's just so interesting. But, I finally worked my way through those and really remembered loving them. And in my adult life, I'm now with 4 kids. I'm 37. My kids range from 2 to 10. I'm a married man. I'm a family man. I'm a comedian, and I wouldn't want my kids to hear my comedy, but I'm a family man. I think we're very similar in that way. Yep. So I decided, hey, I'm going to do a rewatch, and it wasn't for this podcast. It was just random. It was last year. That might've been one of those COVID rewatches where I was like, God, what am I going to recycle this time? And I just remember thinking, like, yeah, the Jason is cool. Like, seeing how he changes from movie to movie, like, that was interesting, but maybe I was missing that forbidden fruit element of it because it just didn't do the same for me. And maybe I had lost some of that. And I also went back to Nightmare on Elm Street. And I went back through some of the Texas Chainsaws. Not all the old Texas Chainsaws are good, but the first 3 I really enjoy. And we also meet Matthew McConaughey that way, with Texas Chainsaw 3, which is really interesting. But those other ones did still resonate, especially the first Texas Chainsaw and the first 4 Nightmare on Elm Streets are so strong. And so I'm thinking, but still somehow Jason has the same, if not more, level of stay power. And so I thought through a few reasons for that, and feel free to challenge my thinking on this. But I think my first theory about this is that primordial soup thing. I think people, I said soup, the primordial, whatever. I can't say primordial and not say soup. But that carnate instinct, right, is there, that bloodlust, that being scared, especially with friends, like we're all joining together and that scared, that will always be a psychological thing with movie lovers, is that joining together to shit our pants. There's a lot of power in that. Also, one thing, and I watched the Crystal Lake Memories documentary, which I have to add that all the Movie Wars listeners know that I have this list of movie documentaries, which are often better than the movies. And that was this Crystal Lake experience. It was better than the movies. It was so enjoyable. And they talk about this, but the profitability of those movies was so wild. Get this, Friday the 13th won $500,000 to make. To date, the entire franchise has made about $500 million. And a lot of those, I think it wasn't even until, 3 or 4, I don't quote me on this because I don't have the numbers memorized, but did they surpass a $1 million budget? And even 5, which ruined the franchise to a lot of people, is kind of where it dips. But people kept coming back. I think they only made like $8 million opening week, but I think it only cost $750,000 or something to make. Again, I don't know the specific numbers, but Paramount, they were very profitable. So even if they didn't kill it, which, I think 3 and 4, when they opened, were number 1 at the box office. So they did have some that were bangers. I think they made 49 or something. I can't remember on 4. It was a wild number. But the profitability, so it's like, well, who cares if critics like it? And who cares how many seats we fill? Because at the end of the day, we're still making a ton of margin on these. So that's part of the staying power. Also, you hear Quentin Tarantino saying, and a lot of directors and movie people will think this, the 80s is, a lot of people consider it to be one of the worst decades in filmmaking. I think the 50s, 55 to 65, because, we almost had the collapse, which is how we got Godfather, because they wanted to take a risk and revive. Movie theaters were on the verge of mass bankruptcy in the early 70s. And so we got a mass revival with the Brat Pack. That was kind of the last time. But the 80s were kind of seeing, there was a lot of money, but a lot of stupidity. And cocaine had a lot to do with that. Watch any Chevy Chase movie. Halfway through, it goes off the rails. It's because they were doing coke. And that's well documented, right? So you have
as bad as the 80s were, the home video market just offered some really fascinating and artistic stuff that was just different than anything that you had ever seen before. And I think some of these slasher franchises kind of fall right into that, and where but a lot of those, the cover is more intriguing than the movie will ever be. But
Yeah, and you cannot and Matt Damon just did an interview about that, about why movies struggle now. It's because the second wind that movies got on DVD and VHS was enough to if a movie wasn't profitable in theaters, could get it there and get it to more, if not more, profitability wise. And that's when you saw, I think it was don't quote me on this, but you might know, but I think it was mid 80s when a VCR became affordable, because when they came out, it was just like everything else. Like, how the hell am I going to get one of these? But there was this almost magical process to going to the video store and getting a VHS and the grain, and and that gave these movies a lot of life too.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember, actually, we used to rent a VCR. That's how old I am, I guess. We'd have to go rent a VCR, and then there would always be like one movie for the kids and then one movie for the folks or whatever, and you'd always have to sneak down and try and catch that. Like, they always sucked, though. That's the only, like, the better the cover, the worse the 80s movie, I think.
Mm-hmm. And if you somehow accidentally ruined that VHS, you were out $80.
Yeah.
You were like, if you remember that, like rewinding and accidentally like overwinding or breaking it, they were going to charge you $80 at the video store to replace that thing. We should sue those people.
Let's go back.
What's the statute of limitations on that? I think that's highway robbery to charge
Captain Video. You've had it too good for too long. Yeah. We're coming back.
Yeah, we're coming back. I know you've been bankrupt for a long time, but I want my what's $80 in 1984 today with interest. But yeah, my last point, and we hit on this earlier, but also I think when you pair and balance out the profitability, which when the studio has a motive and they have the power to execute that motive, they're going to make their money. But then you have the horror fan contingency. And one thing they talk about a lot in this Crystal Lake Memories documentary, which I highly recommend, is that horror fans will, in the early days of the internet, a lot of the predominant message boards were horror fans, but Friday the 13th fans had these very specific message boards in the early, back when message boards were not on, because we didn't have social media yet. You'd have to go to these message boards. You probably had a lot of experience with those because of your criticism career.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you'd find little subsections of humans that knew nothing except for, they were very highly specialized about their thing and very highly ravenous about defending that against like outside intrusion. So I imagine, whatever subculture Friday the 13th, like, it was probably more terrifying than any of the films in the franchise.
Yeah. And these fans, they talk about in the documentary, they'd be as specific as there would be these mega, threads on these message boards about the apparel Jason would wear. and the choice of, a makeup choice or a movement. I mean, horror fans are very specific. So, you can say all you want about let's be real. The lack of budget oftentimes creates diamonds. You and I were talking about why Texas Chainsaw is such an incredible film. It's a $10K budget, I think. I can't remember, maybe 15. I can't remember. It was low. Pressure makes diamonds. That's a cliche, but it's true. And a lot of the greatest films of all time are the way they are because you face limitations and you have to make choices creatively. That's partially true in Friday the 13th, but a lot of it is the battle with the MPAA. When you start getting challenges on the amount of violence that you can put on the screen, which is what happened especially 3 and after, that's when the MPAA started really coming after Friday the 13th. And they had to redact so much of the violence. And one thing they talk about in the documentary is how much of the incredible kill scenes, which is what is great about the movies, besides Jason just as an icon, is the amount of violence on the floor, on the killing floor, what they call it when you edit a film and have to edit out stuff. And that is such a focus that when you have to take your foot off the gas with the violence, then you're left with what? The story. And I think that it's really interesting with some of the stories you read. Like, a lot of these women were subjected to horrible things on set with the nudity and the screens. Like, they oftentimes were pushed to do more than they wanted to, or what was in the script, and they would push them to do more aggressive scenes. In fact, Danny Steinman, who directed 5, they grafted him from the adult film world. He was an adult film director. He was an exploitation director. And there was this story about how he was coaching these women and directing them like they were adult film stars, not actresses. And it was very uncomfortable. And because of that low budget setting, I think where in some other areas you get Pressure Makes Diamonds, Jaws, Bruce Doesn't Work, all those stories, this was a situation where kind of grifting unknowns. It did launch Kevin Bacon. Sean Cunningham did develop a great horror career after this. Like, people did launch and have a great career. But a lot of people were subjected to kind of the lack of experience and grift of some of these really bad directors, and these producers that were kind of just profit-driven, battling. And their main focus was the violence. And once that was taken away, that story that was what you were left with, which is why I think, Texas Chainsaw and Nightmare on Elm Street kind of win, because they had more thought. And I would say existentially more. What do you think about that?
Well, I think that that the sleazeball tactics and all of the gross energy is captured on screen in Texas Chainsaw. It's like the frames permeate with this just, I don't know, this sense of evil. You feel gross after having watched it. Now, if a frame in Friday the 13th Part 5 is one of the cleanest things you've ever seen, it's kind of gross knowing that all of these behind the scenes things have gone on and people were exploited for the making of this art, so to speak. So, I don't know how much you can blame any individual, or I don't know how much you can blame the entire franchise on any individual entry in it, though, as these seem to be like unrelated projects in a weird way. Like, the first one is, it's essentially, the first movie is like a series of like kill scenes that exhibit Tom Savini's brilliance, and it's a bunch of ripped off Hitchcock score type things, and then and then you come to a kill scene that's it barely, I don't even know if you could call the first one like a slasher, because I don't know how many knife kills you get in the first one. You get arrow kills for sure, but yeah, I think that I don't know. What are you going to do? They were made in the 80s. They were, I guess for what they are, we're still talking about them in 2024. So there's some undeniable quality to that, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm so glad you said Tom Savini, because that was my biggest takeaway from all my research and watching that documentary was what an incredible. If you want to, I think it's interesting because the lack of chronology. I kind of got lost there talking about the budget and stuff and the way that the actresses were treated, because I was trying to make a point, and then in classic me form, I lost the point. What I was getting back to with with this was the lack of chronology, the amount of hands, the amount of directors, the amount of people playing Jason. Like even in one movie, 3 different people are playing Jason. I mean, they had like 3. It was 5. They had a stunt man who got fired, and then they had the actor, but then they had another stunt man. So 3 people are wearing that outfit, you know. And there's just so many people involved. But if you want to, you could almost argue, and feel free to challenge my thinking here. You said Savini, and I thought that is the one item that not only responsible for the staying power, but if you want to say goes in the Hall of Fame, all-time achievement award. I'm not talking Grammys or any shit like that. I'm just talking like long-term Savini's work. The realism of his work is pretty unbelievable. The amount of hours just to do a knife through the chest, 4 hours of just layers and layers and blood. It's not just the look, it's the intricacy of his work. What do you think about that?
I think that it comes from probably his time in Vietnam and having to observe all of these atrocities. And like if I had witnessed and I had to endure atrocities, I would want to make them. I would want to be authentic with my portrayal. I would want to pay them service. I think that's why my comedy has to pay service to all of my childhood trauma so much, because it had to have meant something. So I think if Tom Savini can make that time in Vietnam mean something, and it's meant iconic films across multiple franchises, I mean, he's the best. What can you say?
I love that you said that. That's exactly what it credited to. He was a Vietnam. He was a documentarian, and he photographed, and he also was. I guess he was in the medical tents, and he was seeing just the worst atrocities during the war, and that's what he gave cadence to. And I guess that's such a good answer. I mean, psychologically, he's probably like, I have to demonstrate what this really is. I don't know any other way. Incredible point. So what do you think? So going back to the 4 points, what do you think? Is there anything I didn't think of, or what do you think about just to summarize the 4 points that I think really contribute to the staying power would be the primordial item, the psychological aspect of being scared, the unity of being scared with people, the mystery, I'm not allowed to watch this. Number 2 point was the budget. There was a profit motive. Even if it doesn't perform well, they're going to make margins. Another staying power thing is that the 80s wasn't necessarily, when you think of great decades of film, golden age, it wasn't really competing at a high. I mean, you had Aliens. I think Aliens was the stiffest release day competition it had, and it did get beat by Aliens on that release, but there wasn't a ton of competition in terms of when you think of the golden era of film. And lastly, the tenacity and the passion of the horror fan base, the dedicated horror fan base. What else would you add, or what do you think about all that?
Yeah, I think those are good points. The only thing I might add to that are specifically on the primordial fear thing is there seems to be a punishment for like the sin. That seems to be a big part of it. Like these teenagers are doing something they're not supposed to be doing, and then they're murdered. That seems to be a big part of it. And I don't know from a cultural Catholic guilt perspective, or I don't know where that comes from, but there might be something to that as well.
Yeah. Yeah, and especially, and I mean, to take that further, that's such a great point. And to think they're all high school kids and young age college kids. And you couldn't pay me enough, Matthew, to go back to high school. I mean, if you offered me $2 million to go back to high school, I'd say I'll just stay right here. I'm not brutal. And so one thing that's really interesting is that you see the archetypes that they try, and they don't do a great job. But also bullying was a different thing back then. So they have a different, like we talked about before we hit record, was time and context is so important to every movie when you're judging it. But, when you think about, I don't know about you, but sometimes something will happen and I'll randomly think about the person who kicked my ass in high school or the cheerleaders that made fun of me, but they're now trying to sell me Plexus on Facebook. It's like, but you called me a fat ass in high school and now you want to sell me pyramid scheme products. That is something very real. And you said punish the sin. Yeah. I don't know about you. I was a loser. Which is probably why I'm a comedian and a movie podcaster. I'm not an investment banker, and I'm not saying I would want to see this level of punishment, but subconsciously it's like this idea of that, like the people that were so horrible and harsh getting that, the jocularity, the people that went to the dances, again, I would never want to see what happens in the movies, but I do think there's the fact that it's specifically on high school age kids acting and treating each other the way they do, it is kind of a little triggering for me because high school sucked.
Yeah, and I think high school will always suck as long as there are high schools and there are teenagers. High school will always suck, and so that will always resonate. So
they're not recruiting. They don't have to recruit the assholes. They're not putting up signs. Yeah, they're not.
Yeah,
they're not short.
Apparently they're setting up franchises all over the place.
On our tax dollar. Yep. Oh, that's beautiful. I love it. Cool. So let's go into the Movie Wars crew. I polled you, and thank you for your responses. I would love to hear your response, your gut response here. I just put out there the key slashers, and I'm going to stop using Instagram polls. I'm going to use SurveyMonkey because you can only do 4. It's so stupid. I wanted to add Ghostface to this. I wonder if Ghostface would have gotten any love, but 44% was the leader here, Michael Myers, in terms of favorite slasher. That's really interesting to me because that is what inspired at least created the foundation to make Friday the 13th. 33% Jason, 22% Freddy, and this hurt me, and I think it's going to hurt you too. 0% voted for Leatherface, and we have on TikTok 66,000 people, and on Instagram we have 2,800 or something like that. Nobody.
Yeah, that's surprising.
Yeah, very.
But I don't know. I mean, Leatherface himself is not as iconic, maybe, as the first Texas Chainsaw movie is. I mean, Leatherface is just a part of that weird family, and I don't know. Maybe there's just something that doesn't resonate with people on that like instantly recognizable, iconic level.
There is something about being first to market. That's always a big thing. And I would say too, it's also the most complete franchise when you compare. I think the entries aren't all perfect, but at least, and I feel this way about Alien too. I feel like Alien's one of those franchises, although it's not perfect and it goes off the rails, it still sticks around the lore. Yeah. Halloween does a better job of that than all the other ones, because as much as Texas Chainsaw 3 is fun, it's out of control. It's not even. It makes zero sense.
Yeah, I was there a recent Halloween adaptation that actually was good? I haven't gone back to them.
Yeah, they did the ones. I think they were released straight to, I think during COVID, right? They did 3 of them, and the last one was absolutely horrific. It was a joke. But the first one, Halloween Kills, I'm trying to remember what. But yeah, they did.
I thought I remembered some sort of cultural resurgence around Halloween fairly recently, and I thought maybe that was why. And it kind of like Romulus, where Alien all of a sudden is culturally relevant to people who aren't nerds again for a little while, and
and they brought Jamie Lee Curtis back.
Yeah, that would do it. Do it.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing. They've stayed pretty close. I would say the Nightmare on Elm Street, what happened to them was the pop culture. Like, it's insane how popular. Like, they had the music videos and the CD. Right. And
I was a child, and I had Freddy like gloves and the mask and the hat, and it's like, why is our 5-year-olds running around with this stuff?
Yeah, it's really, that's a great question, and I think that kind of makes sense. I guess the 0% Leatherface does make sense because I think when you think back, it is a group effort. Yeah, I think that makes sense. My stack rank would be Leatherface personally, just because I have such an affinity for the original Tobe Hooper film. I just have a love. It's in my top 50 of all time. I just think there's so much about the fact that was a $10,000 film that's incredible.
Yeah,
I would then go Freddy. I would then go Jason, and then Michael, and then I would probably put Ghostface at the bottom of that.
Personally. At the bottom of the list. Yeah, the first Scream movie is such a powerhouse of a franchise film. I mean, but Wes Craven, he was already well established by that point, so I guess it had every right to be well established. But I think that my ranking is very similar to yours. I think Texas Chainsaw is up there. I think for the John Larroquette monologue alone, I think it's I'm being facetious, but no, I'm trying to think. If you're throwing Ghostface in there, I'm probably going to put that. All right, so we're gonna start at the top. We're gonna go. We'll go Leatherface, and then and then Freddy, just because Freddy was a smartass and Freddy had better punchlines than Jason did. And then you've got, probably for me, I'd put Ghostface and then Jason, and then Halloween at the bottom for me. I just I never had a lot of love for that franchise. I just couldn't get into it.
Yeah, and Robert Englund of the group, I think it's interesting. Robert Englund does the most acting and does a lot of it. Yeah. He has to actually act. He can't be silent. He's a damn good actor. I mean, he's actually a Shakespearean trained guy. He doesn't get a lot of credit. And poor guy, this is who he is, even though he's a Shakespearean trained classic guy. You know, this is one of those things where his typecast got a little out of hand, and no one will ever know anything else he's done.
Zombie strippers.
I don't even know that one, and I'm an England fan. So, but yeah, I think that's interesting. Yeah, and I think this is kind of an improv thought, but I was just thinking about one of the issues with all of these franchises is when you get so many directors, so many hands transitioning, and then they have to like take consideration the chronology. And Friday the 13th, they don't even care. Like in Freddy versus Jason, there's this whole part in the documentary about how like they make a 1,200-mile drive overnight, you know, to get from Crystal Lake from Ohio, you know, like they just literally don't feel like they have to care. And, you know, and you think about, like, I think it's Halloween 5 or is it Halloween 6? That's the curse of Michael Myers. And then they get into the satanic cult, you know, the baby and the baby's born. Like, whenever they did this in Freddy versus Jason, when they start to kind of get into the psychology, to me, he's a piece of wood who swings a machete. There is no psychology. Myers, I could see it a little bit. But and this is where Rob Zombie, too much violence, and I like violence, but just too much hyper violence, but too much psychology in what really are dead pieces of wood holding sharp instruments. I just think that's you can almost say that's where all these franchises kind of go, minus Freddy, go kaput.
Yeah. And Freddy has that charisma that is appealing, and that is, I think, what makes it even more compelling is to have. Especially coming from the 80s, you've got this like zany, almost cartoonish villain, but he's still just as funny and just as terrifying today as he ever was. Now, for something like that to hold up from the 80s until now, I guess it's just a credit to Robert Englund's performance more than anything. Yeah,
he deserves a lot of credit. So moving on just to the entries themselves. So you actually did a pretty recent, you know, discovery on these. Was there a top and a bottom for you of I think we're 13 entries in, if you count Freddy versus Jason? Was there anyone that stuck out as a great and one as just the worst?
I do have a couple of notes here that I thought were important. What was it? Jason takes Vancouver, can kiss my ass. So that was funny.
I'm so glad you said that. Yeah, I'm so glad that was not New York, and there were like 5 scenes they did in Times Square alone, and then everything else is Vancouver.
It was awful, and mostly on a boat. And 6, I love 6. That was fun. I don't know. It's like I can go back and rewatch 6 anytime. You know, I think 4, I think Corey Feldman, I think that's where he broke his brain. So,
yeah. Yeah, I love those notes. And the only reason I don't go Manhattan / Vancouver as the worst is because the redemption factor is Kane Hodder. And I actually, this is an interesting piece. Like, until I watched the documentary, I always knew that Kane Hodder was beloved. In fact, when they didn't cast him in Freddy vs. Jason, it was a huge controversy, like for not just him, but the fan base. It's because he really was the first person to act as Jason. He wasn't just a stuntman. That was his origin, was he was a stuntman, but he was the first one to say Jason needs distinct movements. He needs a persona, you know, a physical persona. The deep breath, the slow head turn. Like, he implemented all that, and he made that rote as part of the character. And so now that I've kind of studied it more, I get why the fan base, the diehard horror fan base is so prone to love Kane Hodder. So that's the one redemptive factor, and I agree with them on that. Jason Goes to Hell, to me, though, even though it has Kane Hodder, was awful. It was awful when I was a kid, and it was awful now. It's... just this, you know, and they talk about this. Anytime Jason wasn't featured in a Jason movie, That's what ruined the franchise the first time around with 5, with New Beginning, when it turned out to be the ambulance driver, which, by the way, please, just a random, I get it. Him being someone else isn't the problem. It could be somebody else, but a random ambulance driver. And the fan base turned after that.
Yeah, I'd imagine. I think you should spoil that in like the intro or promo for this podcast, so no one has to be subjected to 5 ever again.
Yeah, I think I think the statute of limitations were good. I mean, that was what, 1984, 1985. But yeah, and then Jason Go to Hell is just, you get bored. They got bored and they were like, well, let's come up with this really high concept. And they got a good director, a guy that had some interesting, he worked with Sam Raimi, in the director of Jason Goes to Hell. And like, he had all this gravitas and then he just threw it away. But I do think the best one is 4. And I'll tell you why. 4, the final chapter, they treated it like a final chapter. And you can tell they put a lot of love into it. It's kind of like, to me, is still the apex of the Jason's appearance. It's when it wasn't so deteriorated that it didn't make sense anymore. You know what I mean? Like when later when he gets hurt in the later entries, he gets caught up in a speedboat propeller and still bleeds a lot, even though he was a corpse for 10 years. And has no blood left in his body and was revived by lightning, yet he's just protruding all this blood into the water. Like, this is, again, you can't measure the consistencies as a measure of these movies because that's just not what they care about. But 4 felt like, to me, the best filmmaking that they ever did. I think 5, actually, as bad as it is, has some really interesting camera work in terms of how they the footwork and the way they zoom in on, they feature the legs of the killer. I thought that was the only interesting thing about it. 4 feels like it would have been a great actual final chapter like they planned it to be.
Yeah, and it makes sense too if you think about it. It's the first one that had the actual Jason character that wasn't trying to service the 3D effect for the entire movie and just these sight gags, and which it lends itself well to the genre, because if you think to the first movie, it was just a tableau of Tom Savini kill scenes, but if you put that into a 3D environment, just stabby, I guess it's. Yeah, you probably could do a lot more with it than they did, but what are you going to do? I suppose with the technology at the time,
they did that with Jaws 3 too. You remember Dennis Quaid? Like, they had to, like, when you blew up the shark at the end, the jaws had to float up to the screen and be like. They were picking their places. Like, well, this has got to be 3D here. They were justifying the expense, basically. It's like they're filming this movie, and 3 is good. I know it's legendary because that dock scene, that's the first time Jason wears the hockey mask. That's a big deal. I get it. But just servicing the 3D element is so annoying to me. Mm-hmm. But I get it. It was innovative. It was new.
It's the context thing too. I mean, when you're going back and watching it on DVD, I mean, trying to remember that it's trying to service this goofy 3D effect, and which the filmmakers are like, we were trying to use it to tell a story. Like, okay, what story was that?
Yeah. Now I want to go back and vomit watching Jaws 3 again. Awesome. Well, I'm going to close this out with a closing question. I was thinking about what would be a really interesting conversation to close this out on. And I was thinking, it's 2024. It's election season. We got the craziness going on. It's a different time and place. My question to you was, and I love that you have the film background you do here, because I think the comedy stuff will play in here too. Could this type of franchise take it exactly how it is now, all 13, 14, whatever entries, and graft it into 2024? Could we burr the franchise today? And the example I came up with was the fact that, like, on Twitter, you can open up Twitter and see Ukrainian soldiers being blown up. I mean, you're just seeing violence is embedded. Now TV shows are just as violent. Like, you watch some of the Walking Dead stuff, it's just as violent as a Friday the 13th movie. Again, time and context. You could almost say Friday the 13th is to credit for that, chronologically speaking. But let's just take the mores of today. Do you think we could birth, say slasher stuff hadn't happened yet, is 2024, are we going to generate this type of content?
I don't think that you're going to get people into the theaters for those films in 2024 in the way that they are. I don't know what you could do in 2024 to actually scare people anymore. Like augmented reality, or like sign up to have someone come to your house and sneak in the back door and just jump out at you, that sort of thing. I mean, a film franchise, I don't know if you could, it would have the power that it has that it had then. I don't know, unless you're starting actual wars, like you're just not exciting enough to make a movie that's gonna impress people anymore.
Yeah, and now our video games, and I love video games, but I play, my favorite game of all time is The Last of Us, and I was telling a friend the other day I was playing The Last of Us. They redid part 1 for PS5. And like I had to pause. You can do like camera. You can take a picture of your game in game. I paused. I was like, "What is that?" And I noticed that like they captured the detail of like you shoot with someone with a shotgun, and the brain is slowly, like a slug, just slowly trudging down the wall. And I'm just like, my God, like that's the detail. I mean, I grew up on Mario. I had an NES. I grew up on Duck Hunt. And this is where we're at in our video games. This is our pretend time, as an adult. This is imagination time. This is how we exert our imagination these days. As adults, is video game time. I'm like, they got brains. I mean, that's violent. So you're right. It's like,
how can you compete with that on like a flat screen? Anymore? You could just zoom in on any portion of the violence that you want to see, or you just can't compete with that in movies. I don't know if anyone's trying right now, but I love though that I say something like that and then eventually something will come out that'll prove me wrong again, and I love that too. I love when a movie comes out and challenges all of those conceptions and all of that cynicism again. But it's been a long time since one's done that to me.
Yeah. The one I was texting you about, In a Violent Nature, I think is what it's called, and that's considered like an art house take. On the and it's very divided. It's weird. I see a lot of advertisements. I guess it did well at Cannes. And a lot of people, it's very slow, and it's from the perspective of the killer. And when I saw it, I thought it was a Friday the 13th reboot because from the back it looks almost exactly like Jason, but it's these very slow scenic takes, and it's from the perspective. I haven't watched it yet. I have it on my docket, but there are people trying to take new spins on it. But when I read the comments, it doesn't reflect what I'm reading. I'm reading the papers, when I'm reading the critics. They're obsessed with it, but the fans, a lot, it's basically 50-50 on the reception of it.
Yeah. Critical. I don't know. I think we're all bought and paid for now too. That was probably part of the reason why I stopped being a critic, is that I don't know. I expressed my honest opinions, I guess. And I was once threatened to be sued by a Nigerian filmmaker named Pascal Atuma. He directed this movie. At the time, it was called The Trace, and it had Billy D. Williams in it. I was excited to review it, and it was one of the worst things I ever saw. And I wrote a scathing review, and we had to have a meeting about the response that we received to that review. He threatened to sue, and then he started calling the editorial office and complaining. So. I don't know. I don't know if film criticism has the guts it used to have back, in like Pauline Kael's day or something like that, where people were digesting art and trying to, I don't know, have a discourse about it in an honest and insightful way. And I don't see that happening very often out there. I see a lot of good discourse with film fans and social media and whatnot, but I don't see critics out there that are charging ahead and kind of defining the social or like the cultural narrative anymore. And how can you, I guess, with as fragmented as we all are, I don't know how you would do that anymore.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. And I think that's interesting. Yeah. I know when I read film reviews and I'm just like, I don't know if I can take this. And there's certain cultural, high points too. And I feel like a lot of people are just trying to meet, whether or not you agree with them. It's politically is not my point. My point is that there's popular points in the political zeitgeist right now in the conversation, the social commentary, and you get points by, hitting on those, and unfortunately, whether that's good or bad, I don't think that should extend to art. Art is always comedians. I always, when people ask me what writing stand up is like, to me, you got a pedestal and you got a subject on that pedestal, and the comedians are just changing that light 45 degrees and giving you the new light. And that's what art is. Art is the new perspective. It's a perspective that maybe the lesser creative inclined may not pick up on. And that's not an insult to the lesser creatives. I'm just saying that's our role.
Yeah,
and
absolutely. I felt. Yeah, I'm sorry. I was.
No, please.
In my days as a film critic, I always thought that my job was to kind of offer that way for other people to understand what I saw in something that they weren't able to see. It's like you have to bring them to that understanding, and you don't do that by like ostracizing 50% of your fan base or whatever. You have to bring everyone to the water and teach them. Like, you can lead them there and let them drink, I guess, but you got to get them there.
Yeah, movies are such great arbiters of the marketplace of ideas, because it's visual, it's audio, it's writing, it's poetry, it's everything. It's every artistic sense you can think of, and it's what a better format to challenge. And to, like, I love how you said bring him to the water, and like, this is where the conversation happens. You know what I'm saying? And movies, that's why I think I love them, because it makes me think about my philosophy, makes me think about my beliefs. It makes me think, what am I seeing? What am I processing? Is the way I'm thinking of it the way the director meant it? Like, am I receiving it the way they meant it? You know, and there's such a great conversation internally that happens.
Absolutely. And then you could get to further that conversation. Does it even matter if you're missing the point entirely? Which is what I told myself to rationalize hundreds of film reviews.
Yeah. Doesn't matter what I...
Yeah. If I got it wrong, does it matter? I had opinions and I said them in words.
Yeah. Well, and you find out too, I mean, you know, Kurt Cobain's a great example of this. You know, a whole generation of Gen Xers, you know, clung to his lyrics, you know, as some sort of poetic guideline for their lives. But like, he openly admitted, he's like, I don't think about lyrics. He's like, I write them last minute. Like, when we're ready to record vocals, I write the lyrics and I don't think about it. Yet, you know, a whole generation of young people, Gen X teenagers, subscribe to it as some sort of, mythology. So
yes,
all that to say, the artists often don't actually know too.
Absolutely.
You know?
And the artists can be wrong too with their own interpretation of their own work. I've seen that before too.
Yeah. Well, dude, this has been a fantastic conversation. I couldn't have thought of a better person to join me for this. So I look forward to doing more with you.
This was a blast.
Yeah, I want to make sure people know where to find your comedy, but find your other work as well. Why don't you tell people your social handles, when they can come see you do stand-up, where you're going to be?
So right now, you can check me out on all of the social media at Blevo Comedy, BLEVOCO. You know how to spell comedy. I try to keep it consistent across all the platforms on that. And you can search for Matthew Blevins Comedian on YouTube. And I've got some stuff out there, a couple of comedy specials from a few years ago, and then a recent thing that was recorded at an egg restaurant, a Christian-owned egg restaurant. So it's the best looking thing I've ever been a part of, and it's like awesome. All right, plus they made like really awesome food, so check that out. It's on High Water Comedy. Check that out, and then what else? I don't know if you can find my stuff anymore as far as my film criticism stuff, because Next Projection, they stopped, I think in 2017 or something like that. But if you email me, I will email you back with all of the reviews, because I keep them on my desktop, hoping that one day. Here's the sad part. I one time took all of my columns from my Saturday column and put them in one Word file just to see how long it was, and it was like 7 novels worth of writing.
Wow.
So I'm just here to let everyone know that I didn't just start wasting my life when I started comedy. I've been wasting it this whole time.
Yeah. You're already thinking of your next way to waste it. You know, That's what we do. That's, podcasting. Maybe you should start a podcast. I mean, there's so many great ways to waste your time.
100%.
No, man, check out that special. Very funny individual. Love that your comedy's out there, dude. And I'm so glad that we connected on movies. For me, you know, for the Movie Wars crew, I'm glad to be back. Announcements: September 29th is the first recording of the core show of Movie Wars. I'm going to have a series of guests that are going to come in and serve. You guys remember Drew and Phil? They started a kind of a venture, and their time is limited. But Drew and I, my best friend, and you guys remember Drew, we are going to do an Alien retrospective in November. So we're going to go through that stuff. But Drew Davis, another comedian here in Nashville, Tennessee, and Seth Keys as well are going to join me. We're going to do The Crow. Nice. I'm a diehard Crow fan. I reacted horribly just to the idea of the reboot, and maybe too much, I'll admit it. I was a little emotional because that's one of those childhood, you know, novelties of mine. But starting September 29th, we're going to start recording that. So in October, you're going to start seeing the new core show come out. So keep your eye out for that. Make sure you go follow Matthew, check out his stuff. And it's been real. Love y'all. See ya.